You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. 2023. What a year that was. For metal, not that great of a year, but it's my personal opinion. Shelly here from Hate Meditations, he always does a year endless, and he did present 20 albums that we can discuss and rank them as we see fit. I do like some of the albums that are on here today, but there's some that I just felt were quite underwhelming. So, Shelly, what's the kind of rationale behind you choosing these specific 20? Was it just, I know you do like a top 40 every year. Was it just like kind of random picking from the top 40, or is this like the top 20 albums?
No, this isn't the top 20. So the top 40 list is a combination of the albums that I think were more memorable. For starters, that's the minimum requirement. And then beyond that, there might be a handful that I think are actually really top quality, but also try and keep the genres quite varied. It's obviously going to be predominantly death and black metal because that's our wheelhouse. But I do try and throw in a few heavy metal ones, maybe some folk and ambient, and I'm not beyond throwing in some stoner doom as well, depending on what I've come across in this year. So this selection is really the ones that are more in the wheelhouse of Necropolis in terms of like the death and black metal. I would agree that the last few years have been a little bit disappointing. I think 2020 was obviously it was a very strange year globally, but I think it also produced quite a lot of really interesting material, and a lot of interesting albums came to the surface that were maybe written and released a year or two earlier. But since then, that kind of promise has tailed off a little bit. But I'd still say it's been a stronger year than last year for metal releases. There's been quite a lot of returning characters, as we'll go through here as well, who have released fairly solid albums. So yeah, it's not been a travesty, but a little bit disappointing, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a couple albums on here that I revisited a few times, especially that Shadow Legion, just because I do know Brian Malone, and I was excited to see that he came out with new music after years and years of not doing anything musically. So there were some standouts. So let's see here. I do have 4 pages of notes, 2 sheets of paper, front and back. Because I had heard about 10 of these albums, and then yesterday I I did my homework. I was being a diligent Jason Post guy of Necropolis and decided just to scribe down some notes just so I do have some level of preparedness, even though I did kind of blitz these albums yesterday. Um, so the first up on this list is La Morte. I think that's how you pronounce it. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Shelley. Um, I did not like this album, Shelley. I I see what you mean by the most memorable, because this is very memorable. It's like retro metal mesh with really scary, ominous, atmosphere, very sparse, very proto. And I think part of the like the drumming on there is programmed to sound not even like a real drummer, just really superficial type of drum texture. The doom element is in there too. It's just very, very, very proto. And I typically stick to like late 80s, forward for my extreme metal, since I got into death metal and black metal so young. And I mean, I really did not ever get into like the Judas Priest and Black Sabbath and bands of that nature. So when bands, harken back to like late 70s, early 80s, it doesn't really mesh with me. I just did not like this album. I know you wrote an article on it, and I read the article, and it was not positive. I did not think it was a positive review. So, what's your kind of thoughts about La Morte?
So it kind of took me by surprise. Um I agree that it's really basic, I almost treat it like a comedy album in a way, because it takes sort of the Autopsy brand of death metal, simplifies it further, blends it with what I would describe as elements of gothic rock. The programmed drums obviously lend further to that kind of general vibe. And yeah, I think they are deliberately programmed to be as artificial and basic as possible to make it very clear that you are listening to programmed drums. So it doesn't really function like a death metal album. It's more in line with, yeah, very early sort of cultist thrash from the early 80s with really basic melodic flourishes as well that aren't, you couldn't really call them guitar solos or guitar leads. They're more just 2 or 3 note like transition passages just to kind of vary the pitch a little bit. And yeah, the vocals are quite comedic as well. So for me, I knew in submitting this album into the pit of Necropolis, it would be the wild card one, where it's either, I knew that you would either kind of think it's okay or absolutely despise it. So I kind of knew what I was doing with this one.
I wanted to rank it as an F, but it is very memorable at least. I mean, it irked the shit out of me when I listened to this yesterday. It looks like Tyler's joined. Thank you, Tyler. We just got started without you. We're running a little late, so I apologize for that. We're on the first album, La Morte. Did you have a chance to check that out, Tyler?
Yeah, I did. But if you guys want to finish up talking about it, I can just jump in on the next one. I don't want to hold you up.
No, we just said our bits and pieces about it. If you want to chime in, do you want to?
Do I want to chime in?
I hated it. Shelly, where would you rate it? I didn't get that from.
So yeah, Tyler, I was just saying it was my wild card in that I kind of knew that you guys would either think it's kind of funny or absolutely despise it. I like the audacity of how stupid it is. I think that's kind of where I'm coming from with this. And like I said, it reminds me of kind of silly gothic rock, but not so silly that there's no point to it beyond comedy. I do think there's some memorable aspects to it, but I would rank it about C as far as this sort of ranking is concerned.
I would not rank it a C. Yeah, this is not my cup of tea.
It wasn't mine either, Tyler. I was fucking like, why the hell did Shelly send this album to us? Like, and it made me want to have a fucking drink after listening to it just to fucking relieve the dissonance from my brain a little bit. Just to relax a little bit. Holy shit. This album's fucking bad, Shelly.
I'm not above trolling you guys.
Well, you certainly accomplished it with this one. I generally have like a good idea of the kind of I don't know, the kind of taste that you have. And for the most part, I'm like, hey, yeah, Shelly has got a pretty solid idea of what is good and what is bad. And when I listened to this one, I was a little confused. I was like, huh, this doesn't really sound like something. I was like, oh, I know that Shelly listens to Rammstein sometimes, so maybe this is one of those outliers for him. Yeah, I was a little taken aback.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it as an outlier. I don't for a second think this is up there with some of the more sophisticated death metal that we've had this year or black metal. It's more of like oh, this is pretty funny. Like it's not sort of heady or artistic or anything. I was just like, I quite like the audacity behind it, but you guys have much less patience for that kind of thing. So I'm not surprised that you guys want to rank it at the bottom.
Yeah, I thought about it F, but just because it is very memorable, as you said, just I don't know if it's deliberately annoying on purpose, but yeah, I was annoyed listening to this quite a bit. Tyler, would you rank it as a D or an F?
An F.
I think it stays as a D then. Wow, enough. You didn't even like the memorability of it. It's just everything about it is just anti-Tyler. All right, let's move on to that Profanatica. Crux Simplex. I thought this was a great return to form album by Mr. Ledney and crew. And honestly, this is my pick for 2023. I feel that overall this is a great statement for Profanatica. It's all the best strengths, and it's very, very deliberate music. You know what you're getting from Profanatica, and it's just executed very well on this album compared to the last one, at least. And I just feel that it's very, very authentic American black metal, like the most authentic actually. But yeah, very, very strong album. Great interplay between how the riffs flow and emerge, and just the sinister atmosphere that Ledney and company create. A strong A for me.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. So after Thy Kingdom Come, which is probably one of the strongest albums of the 2010s for me, I do feel a bit like Profanatica started losing their way. The Curling Flame of Blasphemy was solid but a little bit forgettable, sort of an album of filler. And then Rotting Incarnation of God felt a bit like a band trying to do the Profanatica thing but not quite succeeding. It was a little bit more polished, more cinematic, and you kind of got the sense that it was losing its edge a bit. So at that point, I was like, maybe Paul and the gang are kind of losing their touch a bit here. But I was pleasantly surprised by this one. I think it was, yeah, as you say, a solid return to form. I wouldn't say it's as strong as like his material from the late 2000s, early 2010s, but it is definitely like a course correction. It sort of steadied the ship of Profanatica. So yeah, really solid, really feral, very abrasive, kind of tinny, and that classic very simple but elegant and engaging Profanatica riffing style as well, even though it's a different guitarist this time around. So yeah, definitely A ranking for me.
All right, two A's. Is it going to be triple A according to Tyler?
No, I would give it a C.
Oh,
So yeah, I did think this was an improvement upon their last album. Also upon, I believe it was one EP that came out between their last album and this one. Their last album, I kind of felt like lost some of the memorability, which seemed to be kind of what Shelley was saying in his assessment of it. The Rotting Incarnation of God, I believe, was the last album. But still, my issue with this one was that it kind of accomplishes aesthetic, I feel, a little more than substance. I didn't feel that it had as strong and distinctive of themes as they had on Thy Kingdom Come, and especially not as they had on Profanatica. So, I mean, really, when it comes to Profanatica, I'm kind of a early demos and the Havohe debut album kind of person, with Profanatica being the notable album afterwards. So I'm glad that they took a step forward. Hopefully it's indicative of a continuing trend, but there wasn't much about the album that made me feel like it was a heavy hitter for me anyway.
Man, I felt that there were some good songs on this album, Tyler. That are good, straightforward, deliberate Profanatica songs, and not trying to mimic the Profanatica style. This is just Profanatica. It's not them trying to, recapture their essence from prior albums. It's just them just continuing it on, creating great metal. But I believe that puts it between an A and a B. Next up is the most interesting album from the list that Shelley had sent us. I hadn't heard about 10 of these albums. This one stood out the most to me. It's that Vile Ritual. I actually started digging into it's a one-man project. And let me refer to one of the pages here. It defines itself as one-man psychedelic bestial death metal plague. So there's some really good things in this Vile Ritual going on. There's a great intuitive riffs. Like this guy can create some fucking killer ass riffs. more death metally, but there's just like an intuitive nature where it's just very sharp when they're introduced and very catchy. Of course, the production's phenomenal on it. The pulsating vocalizations, very interesting the way he did that. It reminds me a lot of Vaughn. I did look into his influences, and Vaughn was one of the influences for him on this album. Uh, there's some droning aspects that kind of kill the momentum on this album because it's such a barrage of riff, 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 and then it'll just be like atmosphere, atmosphere. That just kind of slow it down, but he usually comes back and offers up, back to the riff format and makes it so it's not as boring. I believe this music could be elevated to a high level as in a S tier if it was a little bit more focused and he wasn't trying to mimic other styles like the Demolic inspired riffs on here did nothing for me. And I've heard other bands try to do that Demolic style where like Cathillis from Canada, I believe, that is just the most contrived shit I've ever fucking heard. And it reinforces like Anti Bowman's the only one who can perform, engaging jazzy death metal of the abrasive sort. And there's a little bit on here of that Demolic type of riffing, and it doesn't feel authentic to me. I wish he would drop that as an influence because, like I said, Anti Bowman's the only guy who can do that authentically. However, there's a lot of strong aspects to this album that I enjoyed immensely. And I think if it was a little bit more focused, it wasn't trying to mimic other bands and it created its own unique voice, that it could be one of the main contenders going around nowadays. So I'm going to put it between an A and a B. Honestly, I think the pros outweigh the cons, and I think there's a lot of potential. He's also pretty young, I believe, coming into the game, and it's all a one-man project. He did it all himself. And I heard his other project, I forget the name of it, and I wasn't as impressed with that as I was with the Vital Ritual here. So I'm going to move that between an A and a B. I was very, very impressed with some aspects of this album. I wish him the best, and I hope that he further develops his own unique voice and he's able to come out on top. Shelly, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is one that the guy actually contacted me directly to submit it for review, which is always a bit of a lucky dip because if you're said something and it's terrible, you have to kind of either be completely honest with them or just politely decline and say it's not really something that falls within my remit or whatever. This one was a real pleasant surprise. I think you've covered off the main kind of impressions that I got from it. The thing that I like about it is it aesthetically it behaves like the quote unquote brainy end of OSDM in sort of a Grave Miasma or something with the really
the time goal. You can tell the time goal is an influence too.
yeah, but there's equally there's the sort of the cavern core thing going on, and I immediately start raising my eyebrows at that because I just think, oh, not another one. But I really liked the attempt to mesh that with some slightly more interesting, quirky elements, but it not feeling contrived. So yeah, I did get the Finnish influence going on. I'm not sure I'd dismiss it outright. I think there is potential there, but I liked the idea of blending the very primitive, dirgy, doomy side with some subtle elements of progressive and experimental death metal as well. But it wasn't trying to beat you over the head with, look at how weird and interesting we're being here. It was more subtle than that.
No,
So
the
I
riffs are
appreciated that.
engaging. The riffs alone are fucking killer.
Yeah,
We talked about, a lot of issues with OSDM, with, the vibe aspect where they just, create a cool riff and then it's like it's meaningless within the context of the song. It's just in isolation, it sounds cool, but in the narrative structure, it's meaningless. It's just like they're smoking weed in a fucking jam room, creating riffs, like no logic behind how they're organized and what they're trying to communicate. It's just bob your head music. This, I feel that there is a bit of a narrative structure to it. The riffs are really sharp. That's a good terminology. A good word for it is sharp. It's very, deliberate, in your face. It's like boom, 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 and then you're on to the next progression. And there's a cohesiveness there. And that's why I think there's a lot of potential. There's an intuitive, good riff craft, in addition to a lot of foresight. I wish he would drop. I think he's young and he may just be absorbing a lot of the things that he's into right now and that's coming out in his music. I hope him the best that he can hopefully just create his own unique voice. And I think it's the reason why Tyler is probably going to rank it lower than us, is because he does kind of just harken back to a lot of other bands. But we're so far along in death metal's evolution where it's bound to happen, where this band sounds like this, and this, and this. Whereas you can tell this guy is deliberately kind of channeling all of that. And the only thing that really felt a little bit inauthentic was the Demolic to me. But go ahead, Tyler. I'm sorry,
Yeah, I would give
Shelly,
this.
did you rank it?
No, I'd say between an A and a B is fair. Maybe I'd sit more on the B
Okay.
element, but
All right, Tyler.
Yeah, I would be with Shelley on the B side. I thought that this album was very strong compared to a lot of other albums of its style, where it would where they kind of imitate past successes and don't really accomplish more than just sort of proficiently copying the aesthetic of classic death metal. It did have very strong riffing and it had some powerful moments, and that's a point in their favor. I would say that the major thing that's holding them back, in my opinion, is that what would project it into the upper echelons of death metal, and I feel like this is something that you were kind of gesturing at as well, Jason, is that they never have really a moment like in the best of death metal where the song develops to a point of true profundity. Those riffs that happen in the best death metal albums where it feels almost transcendent, like it takes you to a moment that almost gives you a sort of realization of sorts, even if you can't put it into words. That's a difficult bar to hit, and it's one that I feel like this group is capable of with a little bit of effort, but they don't accomplish it on this record. So I think that they're kind of at the stage of hopefully just figuring out how exactly they want to accomplish that gestalt and what exactly it is they're trying to say with their music. But they did do a very good job of having riffs that are powerful metal riffs, which really puts them a leg above a massive amount of sort of old school death metal bands nowadays. So yeah, I would give them a B.
Yeah, I think a B is fair for it. I probably have that initial exposure right now where I think there's so much potential in this project, and what the creator behind it, Liam McMahon or whatever his name is. I think there's a lot of potential in him as a musician, and like I said, I hope the best, and I hope he creates his own unique voice, and like you were saying, Tyler, and have some moments of profundity, which sounds really really esoteric, aristocratic, death metal armchair guy, smoking his pipe. Is like, yes, this music could be a little bit more Shakespearean or whatever.
that's our thing, Jason. Armchair death metal critics, like.
All right.
Right. Yeah, but it's like it's usually, oftentimes it can be death metal that's seemingly the most primitive and simple that can sometimes hit those moments. So, it isn't always the bands that somebody would expect upon hearing that description, that, they probably would think of something that's very intellectual and complex, as being something that would tickle that itch of ours that to have something profound, but it's really not. And this band actually comes close.
Yeah, like I said, and he's fairly new as a musician. I looked at his metal archives, trying to dig a little bit deeper to see what the foundation was behind this project. So very cool. Looking forward to what he does in the future, and hopefully those moments of profundity. All right. So next up is Cromlech, the Ascent of Kings, or King Ascension or whatever it's called, with the Conan-esque cover. I apologize, Roman, if you're listening to this. I'm not really a fan of the epic doom, and it's a little power metal-y to me. Completely the opposite of what I like in metal. I understand that there's a joyful metal spirit in it, but it's just not my cup of tea. So it's one of those projects I never want to listen to. I know they have killed Cromlech off and they're forming a new band. I'm unsure if they're taking a different, course with that, but the Cromlech did nothing for me. So yeah, it's enough for me. Shirley?
Harsh, harsh. Um, so it's not my favorite style, Epic Doom. I like the best aspects of that, your Atlantean Codex and obviously Candlemas. Um, and Cromlech, like they suffer from being a little bit
Try hard
bloated.
and try
No,
hard.
I wouldn't say that. I would say because obviously these guys playing Into Oblivion as well, which is more on the death and black metal side, but equally focused on sort of ancient antiquity and heroism and quite epic. Their albums are, very, very long in length, but they also feel like they're trying to channel, that Homeric epic quest kind of structure and shape to them. And Cromlech really leans into that. But yeah, maybe I wouldn't say try hard, but maybe they are trying to lean into that a little too hard. I mean, that's just a longer way of saying try hard, so whatever. So yeah, and also the fact that it is so long does make it a little bit unfocused. It feels like these pieces have been stretched thin, to quote Bilbo Baggins, like butter over too much bread. It feels like if the fat was trimmed, you'd have a really, really solid, heavy doom metal album. But as it is, it's quite a slog to sit through. But I still really like when they do get onto something, either a particularly anthemic passage or strong riff. It is really strong when it does all come together. And these are above average composers and musicians in the current landscape of metal, which is why it's in this list. But it's not my favorite, so I'd maybe put it between a D and a C.
All right, Tyler, you want to stick up for your buddy Roman? I'm joking. Roman, I love you, bro. I'm just not a fan of this album. Go ahead, Tyler.
Um, so yeah, I do feel like Cromlech is a band that has gotten better with time. It felt more like on their early releases that they were somewhat lost in the weeds with trying to figure out the approach that they wanted to go with, and were more so just kind of flinging out riffs with the flavor of epic doom metal, I suppose you could say. Um, but and they do have a little bit of an issue with being kind of unfocused. I will agree with Shelley on that. There are a lot of passages that are very powerful. There's not that they're the only doom metal to do this, but they do it pretty pronouncedly. They kind of have a lot of influences from like speed metal and death metal technique in the music as well, which makes total sense given Roman's influences, as well as his other projects like Into Oblivion. But this album kind of just carries on in some ways from where the last album did, in that it has those elements and sort of almost takes a folk music approach, which kind of, I think, actually widens their tapestry a little bit. But with that, not having the riff-based approach of other doom metal or other groups in the heavy metal canon, results in it not having as strong of a narrative structure as some other groups do. This weird thing for me to say, because I know that's an aim of Roman's, is to have more narrative structured songs. And as a result, he tends to compose quite lengthy pieces. But the downside of that, as I've already stated, is that the music kind of ends up going to places where you start to lose track of the context of each individual part. That being said, for a group in its style, it does have very powerful moments. That's a vast improvement upon most other doom metal bands of the epic doom metal style. I like them. The band themselves may consider this blasphemous a lot more than Atlantean Codex, who sometimes kind of has a almost candy pop style melody to them at times. Cromlech definitely does not have that. So I would give this album probably about a C.
All right, so enough a C and a D and a C puts it, I'm gonna say a D, and it evens out to a D. I'm sorry, Roman, just not into that style of metal, and I it's not my thing, bro. But you're a cool guy. You're welcome back on the podcast whenever. So I think it's the solidity or solidity, whatever. Another of those projects I just listened to yesterday from the list that Shelly sent. And I did write a note on here, and I'm just quoting yesterday, Jason. It's not really indicative of today's Jason. They did write, fuck this boring upbeat shit, too repetitive, obviously influenced by early Mayhem, etc., but more proto BM than actual meat and potatoes black metal. Boring, droning atmosphere, D minus.
Again, this was one of these ones where I wondered whether you would dig it or absolutely despise it. So this was sent to me by my buddy Paul in Condemner, who has been a long-standing follower of Hate Meditations, and he'll sporadically message me with releases that I've either missed or from bands I've not heard of before. And he was just like, hey, check this out. So it has the guys from, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, Cult the Ghouls, who are a sort of very well-established Polish black metal act. And this kind of takes the very feral, primitive aspect of that sound and kind of dilutes it even further. I will again admit that it is a slog because they have a certain approach to black metal that is kind of influenced by drone in a way. It's almost like listening to an ambient noise album. They're not really constructing, a selection of riffs and sort of knitting them together into some sort of narrative. They're more creating drones of different intensity, and the riffs are incidental to that. And the vocals kind of tie into that as well, in that they're very ritualistic and chanting. And I think the Mayhem comparison is kind of spot on there. Takes a similar style to Attila, not in terms of the tone of his voice, but more the phrasing and the shaping of the vocals. So I found it interesting, but I do accept that there is a lack of real substance that kind of, sets apart really high quality black metal from the rest. But I still think this was kind of just poking its head above the parapet compared to a lot of black metal that's come out this year. But I would still put it lower on the ranking that we have before us today. So I'd probably place it between, or no, actually, I'd place it as a D.
All right. Shelly gave it the D. How about you, Tyler?
Man, you gave one of your top picks a D?
Well, I'm sort of grading this like in my mind, every album's a winner. Just, but I'm kind of grading them.
Participation trophy.
Yeah, I'm sort of grading them compared to each other rather than saying, oh, they're all S tier or whatever.
I understand. Yeah, I would probably put this album between an F and a D at best. There was not a whole lot going on there. It was a black metal flavored Twinkie to me. And it's funny, I didn't realize that they were connected to Cult de Ghoul, or however you say their name, a band that I have a lot of ire for because of very similar reasons. I listen to it and think, well, this is just sort of a black metal flavored, snack for people who just want to have black metal flavored music. There wasn't really any riffs that were very strong and communicated anything to me other than that this is creepy black metal. And so I didn't enjoy listening to this album at all. And it all makes sense to me now. It was made by those Cult to Ghoul people.
Those
So
Cult to Ghoul people
yeah.
out there in that France land.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it's like everything that well, I shouldn't say everything. Mutilation made some pretty quality stuff, but a lot of that less Legion Lenore stuff has similar problems, although it may be a little bit more esoteric. And yeah, didn't really enjoy this album. I would put it between a D and an F.
All right, it stays where it's at, between a D and an F. All right. So Shadow Legion, I was really excited for this album this year. My friend Brian Malone, who was in the band Diabolic as well as Omnity, just straight out of blues says, I'm working on new music, it'll be out soon. I'm like, wow, that is cool, Mr. Malone. And so good history of him back when I was in Florida after I got out of the Air Force. Hung out with him a little bit when he did Omnity, and turned into a friend. But something that's always stood out to me with Brian Malone is he could have been like one of the top lead guitarists in death metal. Definitely, S tier when it comes to his lead guitars. He's up there, Trey Azagoth, and others up there with the top echelon of guitar leads in death metal. And there's an intuitive nature to it. It's off kilter, abstract a little bit, just enough to where it's interesting, but not too weird where it loses its communication and essence. But when it comes to the riffs of this album, I feel like they're repeated a little too much. And if you streamline each song, there's not really that much content there because the riffs repeat so much that it beefs up their length. But when you if you envision like what the substance actually is there in the songs, there really isn't that much. And then I'm not saying it's an issue because other people may like this aspect of Shadow Legion, is that the influences are kind of all over the place. This sounds like everything that they liked when they grew up was put into what they expressed. And with that, there's the epic heavy metal, clean vocal stuff on there. And, it's not bad in itself, but when you listen to the album back to back, you get all these different types of expression. And there's not really much of a unifying thread between the songs. But then again, the riff craft, when the riffs that are there tend to be really great, and especially the leads are in a league of their own. So I could not place it in average territory. It's definitely above average, but because I do have some quibbles with the song constructions and the actual content that's there beneath those lead guitars, I feel like it could be a lot better. And when I'm one of the few people who likes Infinity Through Purification by Diabolic the most, because I feel like it's the most authentic expression, it's the most experimental, and there's a lot of cool fucking things in that album. Compared to the other Diabolic albums, which did have a very high accessibility with the riff structure and all that, and they did repeat a lot of riffs, a little too long in my opinion. But that, like Brian Malone even said when he was on this podcast, that he wants people to grasp the riffs, so he plays them over and over and over so they can hear how good the riffs are. But I think when you repeat something too much, it loses its momentum. So yeah, I would put it as a between a B and a C. I think it could be better. I do hope the best for these guys, and I hope they keep releasing music. And what format that comes out in, if they want to take my advice or not, it's completely arbitrary. But I do hope the best for them. So between a B and a C for me, Mr. Shelley.
Well, yeah, I was kind of surprised that you dug this so much because there's a lot of heavy metal going on this album, or not even heavy metal, but sort of stuff
It's
that
because
sounds
I'm
almost
friends
like.
with them. I'm going to be biased, Shelley. Come on,
Well,
you're biased with your friends too. Come on.
well, yeah, but you ranked Cromlech pretty low.
Well, I
just,
don't like Cromlech, and I think I expressed that before to Roman, so that shouldn't be new news.
no, but it's just you kind of make a point of saying that the heavy metal element's not for you, but there's a lot of it on Shadow Legion and even elements of sort of bouncy folk metal as
Yeah,
well.
and I think it
Which
makes it disjointed, and I think that kind of there's no unifying thread, and that's my criticism. There's no unifying thread between the death metal, the epic heavy metal, and the epic heavy metal that's there. I would say it's actually above the Cromlech. Um,
mm,
yeah, I feel like there's more hooks and more interesting things going on, in the Shadow Legion when they do the heavy metal stuff. But that's when I look at Shadow Legion, I'm more into like the death metal side of it. And I think there are a lot of elements that succeed, and I already expressed what I think that doesn't really succeed that well. But yeah, I didn't put it way up there. So, and Brian Malone,
no, yeah,
like his leads, like they're fucking phenomenal. You can fucking just listen to his leads all by themselves, and they would be fucking great to listen to. Like the Love of Lava shit that Trey Esgoth came out with, like just his leads, and it's like people want to hear that. I mean, his guitar virtuosity is so up there that it warrants our attention. So
yeah. I no, I agree with your points. It's just yeah, that it just sort of surprised me. But yeah, I think it is a bulky album. It could do with a little bit more focus, but it is one of those albums that feels like an event. Like there's a lot going on, there's a lot to unpack. And because there is such a diverse array of styles going on, there is something for everybody, and that can sometimes be a criticism of an album, which is it tries to do too much and it becomes an unfocused mess. When really you should be trying to hone one specific style and doing it really well. Shadow Legion is the opposite, where they do manage to marshal all these different elements together and still come out with something that is vaguely coherent. It could be more coherent. I definitely agree with that. And it could maybe dispense with, as you said, Jason, some of the influences that maybe they liked when they were younger. Maybe if they lent more into just doing straight up death metal or even more into just heavy metal with the occasional death metal riff, it would have been stronger. But as it stands, it's still above average. But yeah, so I think I'd be happy with between a B and a C for me as well.
all right, Tyler.
Well, so there were honestly, in some ways, this album reminded me of Dissection, and that might just be the sort of combination of death metal and heavy metal that is happening in the music. There were a lot of riffs that I felt like the dreaded speed metal influence that always kind of makes me think, oh no, reared its ugly head. Riffs that kind of rhythmically bounce between two poles and don't really flower into anything all that interesting to me. So this isn't really something that's in my wheelhouse. I do acknowledge that the guitarist is very technically uh, adept. He's very good at his craft. But there wasn't anything in this album that really made it endearing to me that much. There were plenty of riffs that honestly kind of reminded me of a more mainstream, like kind of somewhat like melodic death metal act, might be similar to what Shelley is catching on with, like the folk metal influences, which to me is always kind of like lightly dressed up speed metal anyway. So I hate to say it because I know you have a lot of praise for this album, Jason, but this album was more like a D for me. It really didn't hit any of the buttons that I prefer an album to hit. There's plenty of death metal that has some epic heavy metal riffs, but manages to work them in very organically to where they comment on the overall direction of the piece that I think are better for the influence. And this album was not one of them.
Yeah, I kind of figured that was coming. I probably should have rated it higher so it evens out. But anyway, yeah, I think it falls into C. Um, like I said, I do feel like there's not really a unifying thread with all the different types of expression. But if you take the songs in isolation, pretty cool for what they are. But there's that element. I think the thing is about Shadow Legion, at least in the state that it's in now, that's presented to us. I no idea what they're doing, the jam room nowadays, but it's really the lead guitars that makes it, something special. And when it's just that aspect, I mean, when you listen to the riffs, there, like you said, there's dissection stuff. I even hear like Panzerfaust and things like that coming out in the riffs, and not necessarily the best things in my opinion, but I would say it's above average. But Man of the People today puts it as a C, which is average. So, but it's the average of the top 2023 albums, so that's above average in itself. Everything on here is above average. And I forget what freaking band this is by the cover. What is that?
Ascendancy.
Ascendancy. That's right. That's Tyler's band.
Yep, that is one of my picks.
Oh, you want to trash my band? I'll trash your band.
All right, let's do it.
What did I write? Let's look at my page. I did write notes yesterday. Oh, I gave it a C. So not a horrible thrashing there.
Better not than I expected you to give it, honestly.
What I write? The riffs have good logic, however, they could be better. It's not original at all and very bland, is what I wrote. So average territory. All right, Shelly, go ahead.
I think this album's an A. I really, really like it. It's riff-based black metal. They're a Finnish band, but it's still like it's very borrows a lot from, say, the Greek style in that it's very focused on development of melody and riffs. Although there is, classic black metal atmosphere going on, but that's secondary to the intent of the artist, which seems to be more taking black metal back to its early thrash roots, but injecting a strong sense of melodic development. So there's a lot of guitar leads and a lot of kind of stop-start interchanges with the tempo. It's not focused on sort of building waves of frigid atmosphere. It's more intent on the actual structure of the compositions. So yeah, I've re-listened to it a few times because it was quite a while ago that I reviewed it back in July. But no, I think it's really solid. I think it's actually an EP, this, although it is nearly as long as an album. It's nearly like half an hour long, so nearly as long as a solid black metal album. But yeah, I'd happily rank this as an A on this kind of gradient that we're using here.
Oh shit. I know Tyler's gonna make an NA. So I think that puts it in B territory, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to give this album an A. It's one of the better releases that I've heard in a while. I did like their previous EP a little better. One of the most interesting things about this band, which might make sense given its place of origin in Finland, is that I hear and hear me out on this one, I hear a really strong demigod influence, especially on their last EP, still present on this one too, even though they're billed as a black metal band. There is, of course, some black metal influences too, particularly from the somewhat cross between the more brutal death metal variant that you hear like in the Netherlands and the melodic variant that you hear in kind of is a creeping influence perhaps from Sweden. And so it is, I think, overall a black metal album, but there is a really strong influence from like a kind of the kind of esoteric constructions that you hear in Finnish death metal, like Demigod, for instance. This band is really good at having a kind of start in a more kind of diminished melodic section that then expands until it has a more kind of like, I guess you can say, whole tone melodies that almost gives the impression of like order rising out of chaos. And in that sense, it really accomplishes something that a lot of metal releases today don't accomplish, which is there's almost a statement built into the music itself. You have kind of these flowing melodic riffs that then kind of almost disintegrate or in a certain sense go sour. and then multiple themes, maybe usually about 2 or 3 that that battle it out, so to speak, before they reach one of those melodic sections that injects a sense of clarity, and it creates a sense of finding meaning and conflict, which is really awesome. Does it do it as well as the best examples of heavy metal, throughout history? I think not quite. There needs to be a little bit more of a sense of structure and distinctiveness and theme, I think, before they ascend to that level. But they're on a really good path. And I think that they accomplish what they do pretty well. And like I said, the fact that they actually have something to say is a really good point in their favor. So yeah, I would give this album an A.
Huh. Yeah, I just found the riffs to be boring. I understand the logic behind them is sound. There's good logic, but yeah. So the next up is the Deiquisitor, which I think is one of the best band names I've seen around in recent memory. We can't talk about the quality of the album in that high regard. I found that okay, the note I wrote, it's there's some good generic 90s death metal going on here. Very knuckle-headed. Very generic, not memorable. Yeah, and I rate it as a D. Shelley, go ahead.
So here we are then. This is where I'm gonna have to talk up albums rather than just agree with you guys. So this to me sounds like if Nuclear Death actually wrote death metal as opposed to the sort of primitive death grind that they did. There's a lot of chaos going on, a lot of kind of grinding energy, but I think they elevate that animalistic primitivism into a place of more structuralist, logical death metal. I really like the combination of what can feel like quite organic elements combined with a very mechanistic, percussive approach to rhythm and riffing. And I know we don't often discuss it in terms of death metal, but there is a weird atmosphere going on. I think one thing I do appreciate about newer, one thing that I try to point out or look for in newer death metal albums rather is a conscious desire to make death metal weird again. Because as we've discussed at length on this podcast, there is too much uniformity and too much novelty going on, and not this kind of unconscious avant-gardist spirit. When it's too conscious and pre-planned, it becomes a contrivance. But there is something that's quite hard to put your finger on. But when you look at like classic death metal from the early 90s, a lot of it was just very free and very strange and very weird. And this album kind of reminded me of that initial spirit, which I really appreciated. So yeah, I don't think it's gonna get as high as I would like based on your response, Jason. But yeah, it was an A for me.
Holy shit, Shelley. How about you, Tyler? Do you share those sentiments?
And because I would also give this album a D. It has the problem that I feel a lot of albums in this style do, where it has a tendency to bludgeon the listener over the head and exhaust them by not really having the music develop into something that ties the brutality together. So it was a bit of a chore to listen to it for me. I could hear some of the influences from Deeds of Flesh, Suffocation. I guess parts of it maybe even somewhat reminded me of the second album from Gorguts. But overall, it didn't really take that style to any place that I found interesting, like Deeds of Flesh manages to do on their better albums, like Path of the Weakening or Shadow of the Legion. So,
Mark of the Legion.
Mark of the Legion.
You got mixed up because the Shadow Legion that we ring today.
Yeah. But yeah, that didn't really do that. Deeds of Flesh kind of takes that brutal bludgeoning style and then develops it into actually strong melodic themes on their best work.
The best Deeds of Flesh, I get like these visions, and I'm like in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and I'm having like really primitive warfare with the indigenous people, with like sticks and stuff, and it just conjures up these great images, and it makes me want to be like a feral animal out there. I don't get the same from the Deiquisitor, I'm sorry. But I guess two Ds and an A, that kind of makes it between a B and a C. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
the
agree with that.
Desecresy you've moved there.
Oh crap. I think I rated Desecresy lower than that actually. All right. There you go, Deiquisitor. All right. Yeah, Desecresy I did rate lower. I think we have reached oversaturation with Desecresy now. He has released the same album with minor tweaks over and over and over. And each album, they're not bad albums. It's really the same formula over and over and over, just tweaking it slightly. And with that, I feel like we could skip 5 Desecresy albums for like a substantial new expression coming from it. And I just think he's putting out too much material too often. Great album, Taken in Isolation is a good album, but just the sheer aspect of overexposure to the same styles over and over and over, and without presenting that much new. Yes, he does get into like electronica and atmosphere and ambient and all of that with this album, but I don't feel that it pushes the album into a high enough or different plane to warrant its recording compared to the last albums that been put out. So yeah, I think we've hit, at least I have, the oversaturation point of Desecresy. So I wish he would take a break, just gather himself for a few years and then release something a little bit different than what he's been releasing, continually. So strong C for me. Shall go ahead?
Uh, yeah, I agree. Like the Desecresy thing is basically a production line now where he can just churn out hours and hours of very good but very similar material. But I think if you were to say listen to the first album and then skip everything and listen to this, you could see that there is a very clear and striking evolution to his sound. And I think
Like
this
seven
album,
albums. That's like 7 albums.
yeah, I know. And each one to get like if you think about it in terms of like an evolution, literally, like each stage in the evolution might be much the same as the last, but eventually you end up with an entirely new species. And I think that's what's starting to happen with Desecresy, and that the tracks are longer on here. They're more consciously trying to develop into something rather than just presenting sort of one idea really, really well. And there is slightly more activity, I would say, rather than this very sort of cyclical approach he's taken before. So I would see this album as a step up. But I do agree that it's not like some radical break. And we have had, yes, a number of albums that are of similar quality and very similar style. But I would still put it as maybe a B.
All right, Tyler.
I felt like this album was an improvement upon the last one. The Unveiled in the Abyss album was a disappointment for me. I felt like it kind of capitalized on more of the heavy metal influences that were perhaps somewhat present in prior Desecresy releases. But this album kind of harkened back more towards the esoteric and weird ambient sense of melody that Desecresy had, perhaps with some of the more kind of driving feel that you saw actually on their debut record. It sort of sounded like a cross between Cosmic Transcendence and Arches of Entropy to me. Was it their finest hour? I don't believe so, but they did manage to do what Desecresy does well, which is having a sort of surface level kind of bolt thrower that occasionally moves into ambient underground material like Asphyx and Demoncy kind of style, but really underneath the surface, underneath the skin, you have a kind of like darker kind of nocturnal metal almost like the first Dark Throne or second Cadaver in the way that they shape melody, perhaps with a bit of early incantation, kind of shaping that melodic sensibility and vocabulary as well. So I was really pleasantly surprised by this and listened to it a pretty decent number of times. I'm with Shelley. I would give it a B.
Yeah, I think I was a little cruel saying that, just oversaturation, because I would say everything, past, like, including Mortal Horizon, has just been really just too similar to warrant me checking out new albums. And the material there is good. It's not bad. It's just I feel there's just too much of it. And like you said, Shelley, there is the production line. All right, I'm gonna try to place this next one in F territory. Let's see if it stays there. This is I think I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, but the Anglophonic way to say it is Deletere. Deletere. That's, at least that's what I was calling it yesterday. Um, so what I wrote on my note yesterday is this is Frenchy generic high register tremolo riffing, very boring melodicism, which is done to death. Same tropes that a lot of shitty bands use. And I put Ragnarok there from Norway as an example. And I wrote, listen to Aosoth instead. All right, Shelley, go ahead.
When I agreed to do this, I don't think I appreciated that it'd actually be quite a depressing experience. Just having all these albums that I thought stood out this year, like, and having to go out and bat for them. But yeah, I shouldn't be surprised.
We love you, Shelley.
Uh,
This is the best of 2023. So even F is above a lot of other things out there that aren't
No,
included.
I would much rather you be completely honest with me. It's very interesting to get different perspectives on albums rather than me just writing my little reviews on Hate Meditations. But I've been following these guys for a number of years. They're another recommendation from Condemner Paul. I think they're one of the stronger acts from the Canadian scene. And if I sort of say from Sorcier de Glace to Frozen Shadows to Somber Forests and then these guys, it's sort of a lineage that is most directly related to the latter day sort of Nordic black metal from the mid 90s. It sort of kept a purity to it that kind of ignores a lot of the twists and turns black metal has taken over the last 20 years. And I admire that focus and that degree of just tunnel vision. I do agree it's not very original. It's not gonna blow your head off with any kind of left field sort of elements. It's a very straight up, fast, melodic black metal album. But I also appreciate that they managed to achieve what we would call symphonic black metal, but without really using keyboards. With these very simple kind of contrapuntal riffs where each riff has two elements to it, whether it's a rhythm and then a harmony over it, and they kind of split that apart and then gather it back together later on, and it achieves a very similar thing to what you would be doing with keyboards, but just with interchanging guitar lines that I really appreciate. So yeah, for me, I would say this is a B, but I suspect based on your response that Tyler's also going to rank it fairly low.
You are correct. It did really remind me of Sorcier de Glace, but their worst moments. In my opinion, they kind of have lost. Well, Sorcier de Glace, I don't know if this band ever had it. The internal consistency that makes a song make sense within itself, and because of that, they really just kind of focus almost solely on the melodic interplay between riffs. It doesn't really gel into like a sort of impression of a journey or mixture of emotions. And kind of goes for that atmospheric style where it kind of combines bits and pieces of other styles into a collage of sorts. But it's not really something that I feel like is going to be an album that's going to appeal to black metal purists, I suppose you could say. which may be something more along the lines of what Jason and I are. But it probably is at least somewhat of a decent introduction for people who are trying to get into extreme metal from bands that kind of have a more rock-like approach to melody with somewhat of a gothic edge, like Opeth or Edge of Sanity. But it doesn't really get to the point of, like I said, the best of Sorcière de Glace, like as an example of one of their good albums, like the Pure Essence of Primitive Forests, where it knits a few riffs into a loop that has some deviations that kind of creates a sensation of going on a journey. So I would give this album a D.
B, so a B, D, and F. Is that a D plus?
Yeah, D plus.
All right. After the Cruciamentum, is it okay if we take a 5-minute break?
Sure.
All right. Let me get my page here. I actually rated this not that bad.
Okay, I thought you were losing patience with it.
Yeah, I did. The note I wrote was Encanto, MO, worship, very stale, good logic, doesn't present anything new. EP, demo were better, more competent than most. B minus.
Oh, okay. I so I think I was in a minority in that I wasn't blown away by their first album, which was released all the
Neither
way
was
back in
I.
20.
No, I'm with you there, Shelley. I didn't like it. I like their the demo and the EP a lot more than their full length.
Yeah, it was released all the way back in 2015, so it's been a long time coming with the follow-up, and I was really pleasantly surprised by this. There is the obvious incantation, cavern core, cavernous thing going on,
I
which does
think the abstract aspects are also like derived from like the school of immolation.
there is that also going on in there, but it does put it aesthetically in line with a lot of contemporary death metal, and as I mentioned with the Vile Ritual as well, sort of grave miasma. But I think Cruciamentum here are doing what I kind of wish grave miasma did, but are too boring to put themselves together that way. There's also elements of more percussive kind of rhythmic play. It's not all about the melody or the atmosphere and the doom and the drone. There's a slightly more substantive, complex riffing going on here that I really appreciated, and I like the fact that it's a standard sort of album length. It's about 40 minutes, but there's only 6 tracks. But they managed to make very coherent, tight death metal over the course of tracks that are reaching 8 minutes long that keep me engaged, which is really rare, I think. A lesser band I would be bored to tears by in this style, where I would have to shut it off because it is so monotonous and homogenous. But Cruciamentum really do shift it around a bit, and they're not afraid to toy with non-death metal aspects. The final track has elements of sort of flowing jazz drumming, but again, it doesn't feel forced. It works really well in the context. So I think they knocked it out of the park with this. I'd happily put it between S and A, if I'm being honest.
Shelley?
That was me. You mean Tyler? Or are you gonna say
No,
something to me?
I was just flabbergasted for a second
Oh,
there.
okay, fair enough.
Your rating. Like why? I know you just said why, but wow, that's a very, very fucking high rating. Tyler, what are your thoughts on the new Cruciamentum?
These guys are competent. They certainly know how to put together riffs well, and they certainly are able to create a passable sort of take on the classics of the death metal canon. All of their influences uh, that they sort of resemble have already been listed. But my problem with them for a long time, since like you, Jason, their demo and their EP has been that they don't really build off of their riffs into anything. It can give you a sense of, oh, this is pretty good, death metal riffing, but the music doesn't really, I've been saying this a lot, go anywhere that makes it anything more than that for me. And I was expecting that going into this album, and perhaps that colored my listening experience. But I'm always hoping that's not going to be the case. And these guys give me more hope than others because I know that they're capable of it and because of how competent they are. But unfortunately, this album fell into a similar trap as their discography from their first album forward, in my opinion, in that it didn't really rise above that level of having competent death metal riffs. So I would give this album a C.
All right, that's some brain fuckery. Try to figure out between an S and an a C, and a B and a C. I think that averages out to a B plus. That feels right. A B plus.
Yeah, B plus.
It's all right, Shelley. I'm sure that when we get to some of these albums that I feel strongly about, that Jason will have some choice words about them as well. So we'll be in about the same boat at that point.
No, it's fine. It's I actually like getting a different perspective on it. I think people take it too personally when you criticize an album that they really like because they want to be able to just consume their product without any friction. And if you call it shit and explain your reasons why, then you're a gatekeeper. Whereas I just think if you like something, you should like it enough that someone else's opinion won't affect your enjoyment of it.
Absolutely. I always tell people that, and this applies to anything, even music that I think is absolutely terrible, that the one argument for liking something to which there is no rebuttal is I like it because I like it.
Yeah.
You know, if you like it, that's the end of conversation at that point. You know, if you want to discuss it in more detail, I might have some points to make, you know. But if that at that point you all you have to say is, well, I understand you have your feelings about it, but I just like it, then there's nothing more I can say.
Yeah, yeah.
Which album was this one, Shelley? The one with the inverted cross as a logo?
So I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Suhnopfer,
Oh yeah,
Suhnopfer. French, but and French
Snoop,
black metal.
Snoop for
I've
Snooper,
never heard anyone pronounce it, so
Snooper for. All right. The note I wrote was exactly the kind of melodicism that annoys the hell out of me and potent music. Hopefully this isn't one of your cherished bands, Shelley. I know. I'm not here to offend you. It just didn't resonate with me, and I didn't like it. So
oh, this is going to fuck up the rankings because this was going to be my first S tier.
really,
So I was just saying to Tyler, like I appreciate people having very honest and different opinions to me. I'm not one of these people that needs validation for the things that I like. I'm confident enough
you know
in my
what? I can
taste.
respect that. Maybe I'm skewing it too much. I'll put it as a D at
You
least.
don't have to. You don't have to for my ego. I'd rather you
I
rank
want
it
to
where
be
you
friends
feel.
after this. We can be friends after this. I'll move it up.
Okay.
Okay.
So again, I do appreciate that it is a very dense, very explicitly melodic black metal, which isn't for everybody because it is so of its genre that if you don't like that genre, then I could see it being just a cacophony of noise. But for me, I have a real soft spot for the, I guess you could say it's sort of the black metal that references heavy metal most directly. Dissection being the band that always comes up in that regard, even though I think they're probably one of the worst examples of that, even though the most popular. But these guys, or it is just one guy, I should say, is sort of a direct descendant of that, but takes a very specific, very hectic, very dense variant of it and just stuffs the music with so much content and so many ideas that yeah, I could understand people just thinking it is a bit incoherent, but for me, it's like I admire someone who is able to treat melody as a sort of to weaponize melody, because we live in a time when there's so much experimental, avant-garde, you know, bands claiming to be genre defying and doing all of this kind of weird and mostly kind of meaningless stuff with metal genres and blending it with all kinds of things. And very rarely does it actually come off with anything coherent or artistic. And I think for someone to just step back and say, I'm just going to create a pure piece of melodic manipulation and see if I can express some kind of artistic character with that tool, I think that in itself looks like quite an act of experimental defiance in this day and age.
If someone's operating sheerly in the diatonic realm, I tend to think less of it because that can be taught to you in school. It's not something that comes from the soul, to me personally. And that's the kind of thing that irks me about a lot of this melodic black metal. That it is very, very, very diatonic. I mean, anyone, who goes through like music theory can figure out how to create the melodicism that's displayed here, and it's not very special to me. So that's why it kind of annoys me. But I understand we have, different tastes in music and come from different backgrounds. So
I think anyone can do it, but not everyone can do it well. But yeah, I understand where you're coming from on that. But yeah, sorry, Tyler.
I wasn't especially fond of this album either. It kind of, as I can almost imagine, drawn from Sammath saying, because he has a lot of sort of scorn for the black metal promotion YouTube channel, black metal bands. It's too happy, mate.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, this is major key, black metal, and it's just,
yeah, that's a frequent criticism he has of these kind of bands. And the way I would put it, that I think kind of touches on a similar note, is there's not a lot of contrast going on. The songs almost sound interchangeable with one another because they are largely doing the same thing. They're relying on the same mechanic. To where I had a difficult time sometimes distinguishing if I had moved to another track or not. Yeah, I feel like it needs more internal contrast to make the songs more distinguishable and to make them more entities with more character. So I would give this album a D.
all right. S, D, D. I think that S really moves it up to like C plus territory.
Yeah, around C plus.
Maybe we should get a calculator sometime for this. All right. What's
Betrayal.
Petrale.
So again, I should mention, I want you to be honest with me, Jason, but this is another one where the guy contacted me directly for a review, and I gave it a very positive review.
Okay, yeah. I understand a lot of musicians out there are very sensitive, especially if the music is very personal to you. And the thing about being a musician is also having thick skin. I've heard the worst things ever thrown at me throughout the years that to any sane person it would destroy their sanity. But granted, I'm feral, so I can put up with it. But yeah, I understand there's a very personal element to music when you're making it, and it can be kind of hard to detach yourself from that. And it's something that comes with experience where you are able to detach yourself. You can look at the empirical aspects of your music and analyze it kind of from a bird's eye view rather than being in the middle of it. And that's just part of life. I mean, anything with the artistic endeavor, of course, people are throwing their souls into it. And but with this album, I viewed it as a very generic deso black metal from the note that I wrote. And it sounds quite French from being from Croatia. But yeah, I did give it a D, Shelley. So I do apologize if this has hurt anyone's feelings, but it's just my honest opinion of listening to it. Granted, I did not spend a lot of time with it. I did listen to quite a few albums yesterday and wrote notes on each one. And the one that really stood out to me was that Vile Ritual, because I do see potential in it. This album just didn't do much for me. Shelly, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, stylistically, it does sit in the dissonant black metal oeuvre, but it's another one of these where, although they're operating on the same territory as a lot of tripe, I think this does a lot to stand out, and it's kind of again what I think dissonant black metal thinks it is, but it very, very rarely achieves. And I actually, in my review, I compared it to Mephitis in a lot of ways, in that it uses tonal ambiguity as a sort of vocabulary for constructing compositions in a really interesting way. Aesthetically, it takes a much warmer approach. It's sort of aligned with sort of Southern European, very kind of dirgy bass, heavy kind of guitar tone, and also sort of pre 1990 black metal and before the Norwegian style kind of took over and sort of dominated what we understand black metal to be. So there's an interesting mix of like early thrash and heavy metal influences going on with a very, very contemporary use of dissonance that I found really interesting and really engaging. So yeah, for me, it's sort of up there between S and A, but obviously the way it's going at the moment, I think this is just going to be me going out to bat for these releases in in the face of the tirade of criticism from yourself and Tyler. So yeah, Tyler, what did you think?
Didn't like it. Um, um,
All right,
uh,
so it's
yeah,
another D, right?
Next.
Let's move
uh,
on. Let's just
yeah,
move on. We've already discussed it. All right.
yeah, I'm all right with that.
All right, so let's move that. I think it averages out to you
About
rated
there,
it
yeah.
yeah, rough. I think it falls into C territory because you rated it lower than
Yeah.
just S. It was between a S and an A. All right. What's this thing? Is this that?
Sepulcrum.
Oh yeah, I rated this one pretty well.
Chilean sort of death thrash.
Yeah, let me see my note on that. Memento. I did give it a B minus, so let's move it to the B minus territory. Good South American death metal. It's more Euro death influence in Florida that I felt. I felt kind of like Asphyx and some other stuff like that, but it doesn't feel like it has its own voice. It's like it's really competent at their influence, which is very specific, unlike the Shadow Legion. Um, but yeah, I think it's definitely a bit above average, very competent. Yeah, between a B and a C for me. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, so when I was going through albums to review, I was very close to shutting this one off and just sort of writing it off because initially it does come across as very, very generic, um, almost a little bit retroist, sort of, yeah, death thrash metal. But I probably gave it one more track and I was like, actually, no, there's something going on here that's actually above average. And the more I listened to it, I kind of realized that it's I do agree there's probably a lack of identity and that there's no showstopper or as Tyler would say, sort of moment of profound revelation anywhere. But what this is a genre done to perfection. Like it's just played really, really well, very solidly constructed. Everything is tightly balanced. Everything is um, arranged just as it should be to kind of give a really strong example of what this genre sounds like in a technical and intellectual sense. I feel like maybe there is an element of artistry missing, that magic that makes an album stand the test of time. So this does need to sort of craft its own identity a little bit. But as far as like the mechanics of how to play really, really solid, straightforward death metal goes, this is really, really good. So I probably rank it as a B plus in my book.
All right, that plus was a little delayed. It was like
Yeah,
just move
I
it
was
up there a
thinking
little
B,
bit.
B. No, I'll give it a B plus.
All right, Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like this music has its heart in the right place, but it doesn't really understand melody and or rhythm. So you end up with like a series of riffs that sort of fit together, but don't really talk to each other. So you kind of have a that the songs maintain a mood, but they don't really have like a continuity of movement.
I
You
get
have
that from a lot of South American death metal. I get the same feeling like that. Very, very competent in a lot of different ways, but when it comes to like continuity of, we talk about the narrative structure and things like that, where it's kind of a disconnect there. I know we haven't gotten a Blood Oath yet, and I actually rate Blood Oath higher, but go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, you also have that effect that can kind of make the style a little boring to me at times, where every bar ends with an abrupt fill or like a double bounce, and you have a lot of riffs based on like visual patterns that are kind of padded with really obvious next notes to kind of create a sense of symmetry and scalar completeness. And it's gratifying in worshiping like the old school, but it doesn't really have any interest, somewhat like Shelley was saying, in like a musical, artistical, or even like a fun, like sense that some other bands can have. Really kind of made me feel like this band belongs in the cadre of groups like Crisian or later Mortem. So I would actually give this album a between a C and a D.
It's lower than I expected.
Yeah, I think that's a little too harsh. But I'm a man of the people, so I have to move in the ways that the people speak. So I think it stays where it's at.
Stays where it's at, yeah.
All right. I think the Blood Oath is a little bit better. So much like the Sepulcrum, it's good South American death metal, but this one's in the Floridian death metal style. And we did, speak briefly about this when we did the OSTM episode. There's a lot of great aspects where I do feel that they succeed, but then again, it's just when you listen to it, you immediately think Floridian death metal, and it doesn't have its own distinctive voice. However, I think this one actually has better flowing songs, better riffs, and yeah, definitely a strong B for me.
So last year, Mortify, another Chilean death metal band, were in my top 5, I think. This year we've got these two. I don't know quite where they're going to sit in the rankings. Blood Oath is definitely close to being one of my albums of the year. I should also mention of my top 40, some of the albums aren't here, but there's about 6 bands from Chile. I didn't submit some of the others because they're not sort of in this oeuvre, but yeah, I just just to point out, I think there's something in the water down there that is worth keeping an eye on. But yeah, the Blood Oath, I do agree, yeah, strong early 90s Floridian kind of style. But as I mentioned earlier, the thing I love about Blood Oath is not just the riff geometry and the knowledge they have of how to construct really well-crafted death metal in a way similar to Sepulcrum, but they also have that weird flair, that ear for making things sound a little bit eldritch and a little bit eerie and uncanny, but in a very natural, unforced way. It sort of inserts itself very easily into the music and kind of unsettles it in all the right ways. Doesn't feel contrived or forced at all. And I should also say, just checking out these guys, they're all pretty young. They're all in their early 20s. So I think it's a really impressive feat for them to craft such a convincing example of quality death metal. It kind of puts a lot of older bands, even some of the original bands, what they're doing today, kind of to shame a little bit. So yeah, I'd probably put it up as an S, to be honest.
Well, when we talk about S's, we mean like timeless classics, like the Burzum and all that.
Well, no, I'm sort of doing it on this gradient where obviously I don't think this is as good as like in the Nightside Eclipse or something, but I'm saying like on this gradient that we have here, I feel like there should be some S's, some F's, whatever, as kind of like benchmarks. So I think in terms of the albums I've heard this year, this is one of the best, and it definitely deserves to be in S tier.
I don't think we've been operating on the same logic. Because I
That's fine.
figured like if a timeless classic came out this year, I would put that in the S. But
Well, we won't know it's going to be timeless because it's not been out for long enough.
Hey, Shelley. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, so there were a lot of riffs on this that reminded me of Later Death.
Yeah, me
Um,
too. But I think they were packaged better than what Death did with them. So,
yeah, I
but,
think so too. They had a bit more of a that kind of classic death metal labyrinth and riff structure than Later Death was doing, where honestly, it Later Death was kind of really more like power metal or they call it progressive metal, but it's not really all that progressive most of the time. Um, and this album didn't have really like that style, but the way that the melodies were shaped was, and the aesthetic of them was very reminiscent of Later Death. Um, I thought that there were some good moments, but I didn't really latch onto this record the way that I guess Shelley did. There wasn't anything in it that really made it stand out among other bands trying this style, of which there are a handful in the new old school death metal scene. They were, uh, it was impressive how much of a grasp they had of their craft. I'll say that. But overall, I thought that it was just an interesting attempt to imitate a less imitated style than anything that I thought was really all of that high quality. I would probably put it between a D and a C.
huh?
I said I would probably put it between a D and a C.
I
Huh?
think he heard. He's just surprised.
Ah, I see where this is going. Okay.
That is harsh. I mean, again, it's it's your ranking. You can do what you want with it, but that is harsh.
Yeah. I think it stays where it stays. Another one of those. Maybe a B plus. Do you rate that a strong S, right, Shelley?
Yeah, again, not like a timeless classic, but in terms of like the
All
albums
right,
that I've
it
linked
stays
this
where it's
year.
at because yeah, S is for timeless classics. Okay.
All right,
It's
all right.
okay. I'll have to fight on this next one, so it'll be
Oh, let me refer to my notes here.
Oh, I've
Right.
got a challenge for you on this one, Jason. Try and talk about it without referring to godless arrogance.
My first note was this album is proof that godless arrogance was a fluke.
I wanted to get your opinion on it on its own terms rather than comparing it to that.
I mean, I think Godless Arrogance is one of the best recent or black metal albums, recent memory, past 10 years. Um, but yeah, they how can they release Godless Arrogance and not come close to that again? You know, they try it over and over and over, which makes me think it's like a Deicide Legion where that was a fluke too. Like that was just a fluke. And so I think, you know, it has the same aggressiveness as Deicide Legion. It's better than their last album. I will say that. But the last album was a D. So yeah, moving into a C territory. I don't think it is that great. I think time will be the true teller of the merits of this album, and I just don't think there's much there. I understand there is some coherent riff structures there, but sometimes Jen gets into like these meandering types of nothing riffs where it's more just about the texture that he's creating. Not necessarily like a core aspect like in deathcore or anything like that, but it just feels like it's not expressing anything, and he's relying too heavily on the drums. And yeah, strong C for me. Go ahead, Shelley.
So I really like this album. Like you, I wasn't such a fan of the previous one. That kind of felt like Sammath color by numbers a little bit. But here we have. So I'm going to break my own rule here. Godless Arrogance is a very different beast, not just in terms of quality, but in terms of the way it's constructed. I think we discussed this when we were talking about Sammath on the Underrated Bands episode, but Godless Arrogance is not a riff-based album. It's more everything works in unison to create a certain kind of atmosphere. And there's a very kind of all the instruments are lockstep, and there's a very kind of intentional way that they upset the momentum that feels more almost ambient in a way. Whereas here there is a conscious attempt to write riffs, and you can pick out not just the influences, but the styles, and how they're being manipulated in certain ways, whether it's a moment of almost euphoria. I guess that's the sort of meandering riff that you might be referring to there, and then you'll get like a thrash riff and then just straight up black metal. But Sammath for masters of their craft as far as that is concerned. I think as a piece of chaotic warlike black metal, it succeeds, but it also succeeds as an exercise in how to really construct really solid narratives through the art of riffing and interchanges and exchanges of energy and so on. So yeah, for me, again, one of the strongest albums of the year. I would probably put it as an A.
All right, Tyler.
That's on me saying compared to the albums released this year, by the way, not that it's a timeless classic.
Yeah, this is album of the year for me. I mean, thus far, we've got one more month, I suppose. Something could come out of left field and surprise me. But yeah, I think that this album really kind of harkens back to godless arrogance in some ways.
No, it doesn't.
I know you develop these like hardcore set in stone positions of like, this is the best one and nothing will ever be as good as it.
No, it's not that. Like I listened. I gave this album the time of day as soon as it was released. I listened to it twice. There was nothing in it that felt like as authentic as the Godless Arrogance, and he even does like the
Okay, so
with machine gun firing to add that extra element of percussion in that one section, and that felt fucking stupid to me.
So yeah, that's like I mean, you're talking about authenticity and everything. That's a really ambiguous thing for me to try to address. When I say I feel like it harkens back to Godless Arrogance, it's much more based on like actual like solid like mechanical observation of the music, and that's simply in the fact that not unlike their last album in some ways, this has faint oddball melodies that almost have like an old world folk style that emerge from the pummeling riffs. I feel like that could easily be described to this album. I feel like I could list concrete examples of that happening on this album, and I feel like that same description could be applied to Godless Arrogance of faint, strange, almost folk-like melodies emerging from pummeling riffs. That's the means, and that's the sense in which I mean it harkens back to Godless Arrogance, not talking about like authenticity or anything like that. So yeah, I wasn't saying it harkens back to Godless Arrogance in the sense that, oh, it's just as good, or oh, it's just as much of a like authentic statement. I meant like something like more on the mechanical side of things. That being said, I feel like Sammath kind of has always had two kind of approaches to its music. You have one that is really blasting or pounding rhythmic destruction, kind of like early death metal, and one that has like a kind of more subtle melodic side. Honestly, some of the more aggressive aspects of the music remind me of some other Dutch death metal bands like Pestilence and Sinister. That may sound weird. I know that sounds weird to some people because there's no riffs that make use of the same rhythmic techniques. But I think
it sounds weird because not many people know Sammath, and you're addressing everyone like they know who they are. So
oh yeah,
I'm joking. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean that is true. Roughly, I do think they're criminally underrated.
I mean, Godless Arrogance certainly is. Yeah, go ahead.
But yeah, they I feel it may sound weird, but while they don't use the same rhythmic techniques as those bands I just mentioned, they shape melody in a similar way on their more aggressive portions of the music. And then you have, like I said, the melodic themes that rise out of it that honestly, is something they've been kind of working on with more recent releases, probably from like Triumph of Hatred forward. But they kind of combined the two halves somewhat on this record, which I think was a triumph of sorts. I honestly feel like on this record they almost venture in some ways the furthest from rock and heavy metal on the whole, because you have these the music that kind of is just purely based on moving up from like chromatic violence into the kind of, like I said, like almost folk-like melodies that emerge from it. And that's really the almost in a streamlined way what the music is totally focused on doing, without any kind of detours into simple rhythmic devices or aesthetic devices. So and also in other ways, I feel like some of the melody and like the epic scope of it even like harkens back to the debut album and reminds me of some of like the ethereal kind of melody that you would hear kind of rising out of chaos on that album. So yeah, I really feel like this is a very good album. I don't know if it can be said it's as good as Godless Arrogance, but it was one of my absolute favorites of this year, album of the year for me. I would give it probably an A plus.
Yeah, I think we're approaching these ratings differently. Like Shelley's talking about just what's presented in front of us, and then I'm talking about like as a metal as a whole, with
I
its
think that
whole
kind of
history.
reflects. I think that kind of reflects our different approaches to albums in general, though. Like I'm always approaching it from the what's it bringing to the table now? Is there anything I can latch onto and write about as a reviewer? Whereas you're always thinking never settle for less.
Yeah,
Which is, it's a perfectly valid way
that's
of,
how I approach it when I'm a musician too. It's like,
yeah, yeah.
but
I always make a point of trying to see the good, even if it can be quite hard to find sometimes. Um, Whereas I appreciate that's not for everybody because life is short and you want to, spend it on quality art. So, yeah.
all right, I know we're running short on time, so hopefully we can get these through these pretty quickly. So the Demon Seed, Demoncy, how you pronounce that? I rated that as a C. I actually heard this album like 7 months ago or 6 months ago. It was leaked to me before it actually released, and it just came out. Um, the first four tracks are, typical, enthroned as a night type of demoncy. However, the rest of the album is super redundant. And because like I think some riffs are actually recycled throughout this album, and it just feels like a really low effort, especially compared to the classics of Demon Sea. So I think what they did is, more competent than most. Um, but after those four tracks, I have lost complete interest in this album. It's a strong C for me. Go ahead, Shelley.
So we talked about, I pronounce it Demoncy, but yeah, Demon Sea is probably correct because it's demon, isn't it? Duh. Yeah, we talked about Demon Sea on a previous episode, and myself, Jason, and Raphael weren't that fussed about them, but Tyler was very fussed about them. And I think I've actually gone back to them again since that conversation. And I think, yeah, there is an element to what they were doing that I was missing as far as the uniqueness of his approach to riffing and this constant flow of melody that is incredibly effective, but very, very simple as well. And it should be noted that these guys kind of carried black metal through its darkest period of like the 2000s and early 2010s when there was just a very low dip in quality releases coming out, but Demon Sea was still putting out really good quality stuff. And they've had a long gap since then, before releasing this. And it is quite amazing, like in today's landscape, that they do look quite subversive and experimental because the approach hasn't changed. It's very straightforward, very blunt, but he hasn't kind of lost his touch for that unique, dark, like a claustrophobic kind of style of riffing that's very, very flowing and very powerful. And it just immediately marks them out against, 90% of comparable albums I've heard this year from so-called primitive, old school, vampiric, whatever, blah blah blah, black metal. Demon Sea immediately puts all of that to shame. And yeah, totally accept this isn't really advancing what they've done that much. I'd liken it to the Profanatica in that it's more of a course correction or just a reaffirming of
No,
a.
there's no course correction. This is actually diverging from the course.
Well, no, I'd say this is more just reaffirming what makes this artist great in the first place. So for me, I would probably put it as a B.
All right, Teller.
Yeah, like you, Jason, I don't have such kind thoughts about this album.
You know what? I fucking loved it the first time I heard it, but then on re-listens, I'm like, then I started hearing how redundant it was, and I do like early Demoncy. And I think those are timeless classics. I listen to those albums, and I have endorphins and all that coming out of my brain, and makes a happy Jason. But this one, it just feels like it was just labor, very low effort labor. The first four tracks are good. But after that, it just becomes super redundant. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, redundant is a good term because the thing about this that bothered me the most is it felt like a tired or an attempt at a tired attempt at retreading Joined in Darkness. I feel like with Enthroned is the Night, they made some attempts to develop their sound into some new and interesting directions. While I think that it would be difficult to say that Enthroned is the Night is better than Joined in Darkness, or any of their material before that, it was at least an attempt to develop into something while also maintaining aspects that recognizably made it demoncy. But this album felt like almost they were kind of resting on their legacy and just creating a kind of aesthetic imitation of their past successes, kind of in the way that newer old school death metal does. And so because of that, there wasn't really for me a reason to want to listen to this album. I could turn it on and get a basic taste or experience of demoncy riffing, but why would I not just go turned on Joined in Darkness instead? So yeah, I would probably also give this album a C.
All right, and Shelley said a B. I think it averages out to a C.
Yeah.
All right. We have the Irish NRA guy. Unsure if you knew that he was an NRA, Shelley, but he is. So the project is Biotheoc, or however you pronounce that. I've been in contact with him for quite some years, guy from Heart Toe. And he had sent me one of his albums before. It's like, Jason, I really want to know your opinion on my music. And I went by track and told him why I didn't like the songs. I felt so horrible because it did hurt his feelings. And this was years ago, Shelley. So he may know it's coming if he's listening to today's episode. Actually did give it a C. Not in D territory or anything, because I do think there are good merits to the Biotheoc. Um, I did write something really mean that I'm not going to say when I was making notes yesterday. But the music does seem a little confused to me. It goes from like wacky demoncy riffs to like Nile types of riffs, and I just feel like there isn't a cohesion with it. And the thing about his music too is that he'll do the riff based stuff and try to make a narrative. And in prior albums, he would actually factor in guitar ambience, like if the pedals creating atmospheric music that's not necessarily like sheer guitar riffing or anything like that. It's just creating atmosphere. I thought that was kind of novel. And there's not really much of that on here. It's more of just him experimenting around with different styles of riffing. And I felt like as a whole, it was quite disjointed and there wasn't much going on. So, and looking at my note yesterday, I did say it's a C. So, I'm going to put it into a C.
That's fair enough. Yeah, he contacted me directly with this release. We've corresponded a little bit. I think it's pronounced Bayfioc, but I could be wrong
He's
there.
been on the podcast before. I've
Yeah.
known him for years, but
Yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, the style he had. So I should point out this is an EP, and I've always sort of maintained that EPs are a great format to kind of try something a little bit different. Whether that's just experimenting with a slightly different style, expanding on one particular aspect of your style, or even doing a wacky cover version just for the fun of it. And here we kind of have him going back to basics. So the style he crafted previously was it's sort of atmospheric, doomy black metal. I wouldn't call it funeral doom because a lot of it is really quite fast, but it's very cavernous, large black metal with a very strong doom metal vibe. But yeah, he does, as you mentioned, Jason, use guitar ambience and sometimes sort of guitar leads, not in a melodic or solo sense, but more like almost what sound like violins in a way. It's very kind of mournful, threnodic kind of sound. Whereas here he kind of returns to a more like meat-headed sort of approach where it is very basic, very bludgeoning. I think in my review I referred to it as barbaric several times, which I kind of appreciated because although you know when an artist says they're going to return to their back to basics or return to their roots, I do tend to roll my eyes. But here it actually really works quite well to kind of reformulate the kind of core aspects of this guy's sound, which is that very doom laden black metal. So for me, it worked really well. I'd probably rank it as a B. I think I'd be a little bit kinder than yourself, Jason.
Yeah, he knows I am the harsh critic over here. So go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, I was not incredibly impressed with this. I had actually forgotten these guys existed until it
Just
came
one
up
guy.
on, yeah, one guy. Yeah. Until it came up on the list for today's episode.
Did I say he was in the NRA? Is it the IRA?
Yeah, you don't mean the National Rifle Association. You mean the IRA.
In Ireland, yeah. The
Yeah,
IRA.
okay.
Yeah, the
I
NRA
did
is
wonder
our
about
thing,
that.
Jason. Yeah, that's an American thing, not an Irish thing.
Yeah. IRA is for individual retirement account. I'm
Yeah.
joking. I just
Yeah.
Googled it real quick. I know there's
He
like
has an
IRA.
IRA.
IRA was like this really like conservative type of group in Ireland and all that. So, and I think that's where the Irish car bombs come from, right, Shelley? The drink.
Yeah, the Irish Republican Army, they were a revolutionary terrorist group that wanted to basically remove British colonial rule from Ireland, but they did kill a lot of civilians in the process. But so yeah, they're quite a controversial subject, but let's just put that to one side.
All right, go ahead, Tyler. Sorry for jumping on you. I said NRA.
No, it's
Like,
all right.
he probably
Um,
probably does have a gun if he's in the IRA. Should probably be a member of the NRA.
yeah, there was a lot of trudging and kind of just pulling back and forth from one simple riff to another. There were some parts that were somewhat pleasing in kind of a basic brutality, like dark cavernous riffing kind of sense. And there were little glimpses of kind of the more ambient style of riffing sometimes. I think that was part of the whole album being very conceptualized. But unfortunately, like a lot of heavily conceptualized albums, the problem it runs into is that it becomes too internally consistent to where you kind of get moping around in the same atmosphere without any real deviation from that over the course of the music. And I'd hate to say it, but it resulted in me finding it a little boring. So I think I would probably put it as a C.
All right, stays as a C. All right, I think the next one is the Conjureth, and Shelley, like when you sent me some of these albums, I didn't know if you were pulling a prank on me or what. But it turns out you weren't throwing a prank on me, that you generally do like some of these albums. But yeah, I rated this one an F because it's too thrashy, and my note is sucks very much. Some major
Wow.
salad. The death metal aspects don't suck that much, but it bored the hell out of me. That's is that quote from the note that I wrote yesterday. Yeah, I didn't like this, Shelley. I'm sorry. It
No,
was
that's fine. This was another one where I did wonder. So I think I've mentioned them on the message thread before. I remember Tyler saying that they're um a little bit unfocused and confused, and it would be possible to lump them in to the old school death metal trend. But I
well,
think
there's
they're
like the thrashy element that just does not speak to me, and I'm not
well,
a thrash guy either. So
yeah. So wait, when you hear thrash, I kind of see where you're coming from. For me, these guys managed to synthesize elements of Deicide's Legion with early Entombed. Like it's for me, that's the angle that I approach them from is this meshing of a very distinctive American style with a very distinctive Swedish style and coming up with something a little bit different. I think they're not like outstanding. I wouldn't rank it up there with the Blood Oath, but I think that they are a cut above your average OSDM band, and there is something a little bit more
Well, all
worthwhile.
OSDM would be below F. Like if we're talking about OSDM as in
Well,
the modern day old school death metal vibing shit, that
oh,
that
yeah,
wouldn't be
yeah,
on here.
okay, but so yeah, I guess I didn't think you'd rank them that highly because I don't think they do enough to warrant sort of anything higher than a B. But I am surprised that they've come that low in your reckoning.
Yeah, I
For
don't
me,
like it.
I'd put them between a B and a C.
All right, Tyler, go ahead.
I actually give this album a pretty low ranking as well. It does stay true to the old school style, but the riffs are very similar. They don't interact with each other more than in a kind of basic rhythm. And so as a result, it kind of sounds a little bit confused and really kind of transient, maybe ephemeral. It's something that I feel like is going to be discarded fairly quickly, and not really, as Shelley has said several times, stand the test of time. So yeah, I think I would probably give this album a D.
All right, I think that moves it up to, you said between a B and a C, right, Shelley?
Yeah, so I think it's sitting somewhere around a D.
Yeah, C and a D, I'll put it there. It's just not my forte. I apologize if you're listening and you're from Conjureth. It's just not my style of metal. All right, the last one we have the Plague Bear. The guys from Drawn and Quartered, their side project, which is more straightforward and simplistic. All right, I have mixed views on this album. I think some of the riffs are really good in it, actually. And I think they do paint a good atmosphere. But I think all of the same issues that I have with Drawn and Quartered could be said for the Plague Bearer. The riffs, like I said, they're serviceable, they're good. They just communicate nothing. And it is on repeated listens, it's very bland. So a strong C for me, average territory.
So yeah, we have discussed this album at length. And one of the things about having a platform where you write reviews, a lot of the time for albums that have just come out or not even out yet, is sometimes admitting that maybe you got it wrong. And I was very much enamored by this album when it first came out. I thought it was a spectacular kind of mix of death metal, some black metal elements in there, and very strong kind of immolation influence. And I think that still stands, but I gave it another listen not too long ago. And I found myself getting a little bit bored actually, which is probably again just an indication that it doesn't hold up to repeated listens. It might not stand the test of time. So for anyone that does follow my reviews, you heard it here first. I'm fallible. I am a human being who sometimes makes the wrong call on my reviews. That being said, I don't think it's a terrible album. I think it's still a cut above the vast majority of stuff I've heard this year. And yeah, the guys in Drawn and Quartered, I know Tyler holds them in very high regard, and they are a quality death metal band. So these guys know their onions as far as their craft is concerned. So that's not to write this off completely. As Jason said, there are some really strong moments on here. But yeah, I would probably put it between a B and a C.
All right, Tyler.
Yeah, as much as I like Drawn and Quartered, I was not as much of a fan of this album. I was a really big fan of Drawn and Quartered's last release, Congregation Pestilence, one of my favorite from that year and one that I still return to. I can understand being enamored with this album on initial listens because I feel like there was a lot of work that they put into making the album stick out. But I feel like in the end, the riffs are a little bit too symmetrical, too obvious, and the songs are kind of circular and have variations that don't really comment on the theme, so it comes across as a little bit disjointed. So yeah, you end up getting something that kind of almost ratchets or loops, but kind of trails off and doesn't really take you anywhere. And ultimately, I was pretty unimpressed by it. I probably would put it between a C and a D.
All right, so it stays in C. All right, any final thoughts today before we wrap up?
You guys suck.
I'm sorry, Shelly. I thought I raised one of your albums up a notch just so we could still be friends.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, it's been really interesting actually to unpack some of these albums. I know some of them are artists that you're very, very uh familiar with, and some of them you've not heard of before. So it has been interesting throwing in a few wild cards just to get your thoughts on them. I think ultimately, as I mentioned, like it doesn't bother me. I like what I like, and I don't need other people's validation for it. But ultimately, I think my main motivation is I'm sort of a consummate optimist, and that can lead me to be a little bit too kind to albums because I want metal to raise its game. I want it to elevate itself, and when I do find a release that has hints of that, I clasp onto it and try to sort of platform it and make sure that it gets noticed. And that can lead me to be a little bit too kind at times. But equally, these are albums that I think have stood out this year. And like I'm not
The tier
surprised that
list looks like a stubby dick.
yeah, I'm not surprised that you've ranked some of them quite low. I think that's just kind of indicative of your differing approach to metal. As I mentioned, your approach is very much just why settle for less when you know what the best is capable of. Why would you bother listening to something average? Which is again a perfectly valid way to approach albums. So, but yeah, it's been interesting. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it wasn't just a shit on your friends and all that. It was just, my honest opinion. Tyler, any last thoughts before we wrap up? I know you want to talk up that Sammath.
Well, the only thing I have to say about the Sammath is I'm pleased that out of the rankings today, it was one of the ones that was the highest. So that makes me happy. Um, but I'm kind of in between you, Shelley, and Jason, in that I may have a little bit more of a harsh critical eye towards new releases. But I also understand that when you're doing a best of the year list, you are talking about the best of that year. And so you end up including releases that, in the grand scheme of things, may not be as good as what you consider the most exemplary releases in the entire genre, but you think that they have a possible positive direction for lifting the genre up back into something that is of high quality. So, I mean, when I do best of the year releases, I have releases on my list that are of that caliber. Jason might not, he may lean, I'm not sure actually. We'll have to hear his piece on that, but he may have more of a list that's the only things on my list are things that I feel are of exceptional quality. And if it's not exceptional quality, I don't see a point in talking about it. And that's totally a valid perspective as well, because, really, when you're talking about something like reviewing music, you're also trying to guide people towards recommendations that you feel are going to be something that they're going to enjoy repeatedly for a long period of time, and that's going to be those high quality releases. So I can totally vibe with that perspective as well. But I see where you're coming from also. I maybe didn't have the same thoughts as you as what were the albums that were positive directions for heavy metal this year. My list, at least so far, may be somewhat shorter or may have different releases on it. But I get your approach. And I think that a lot of these albums do have some decent positive aspects of them that could be worked up into something good over time, or at least maybe other groups could take influence from and do something better with it.
Honestly, the most potential. I'm looking at the tier list and all these bands. I think the Shadow Legion, if they get a little bit more focused, I think they could be S tier if they, streamline their music and become more focused. And I just think Brian Malone has that intuitive type of genius aspect on guitar that can actually make a timeless classic. I know Sammath has that too of Chan with Godless Arrogance, but I feel like Brian Malone, like he would whoop Jan around on guitar like crazy, and it would be crazy to see them actually be in a jam room together. It'd be kind of sad actually. But anyway, thank you for listening today, and we will be wrapping up. Again, this is arbitrary rankings. Yeah, three people with three different opinions, ranking albums for the year and all that. Definitely like, subscribe, and click the bell on the YouTube. And if you're listening on Spotify, thank you for telling me that I have a nasally voice.